Hello everyone and welcome to my video on the Olympus Pen EES-2. So had a number of requests for this over the years. We're finally going to make it. And we're going to be uncomfortably close to this camera the entire time because the only other option we have is to be uncomfortably far away. The Olympus Pen EES-2 is a 35mm half-frame shutter priority viewfinder camera. All right, what does that mean? It means that it can take any 35mm film within the range of film speeds that it can accommodate. It takes half-frame images, which are half the size of a standard 35mm negative. So if we open up the camera back really quickly, we can see that that is the size of the image that the camera will take when it takes a photo. Very small. Shutter priority means that when you use this camera, the way that it works is that you will set the shutter speed and the camera will automatically choose the aperture. Now with this specific unit that I'm using, we aren't going to get to see that exactly because the aperture is stuck. So yeah, a bit frustrating because I would have really liked to have used this camera. Anyway, and viewfinder means you look through the viewfinder window here from the back, and then you just sight up your scene approximately with the viewfinder. You don't have any focus accuracy information when looking through this camera. This has a full scene averaging selenium meter right here around the lens to control your aperture. So basically you'll dial in the shutter speed. The camera will use light information that it receives through this whole metering cell right here to determine what aperture is needed based on the light in front of the camera, the film speed, and the shutter speed you've selected. It uses a leaf shutter inside of the lens. The shutter speeds are one of either 1/40th of a second or 1/200th of a second. The camera can select automatic shutter speed based on that level. So basically, either you're selecting the shutter speed or in auto mode here, you're selecting the I misspoke on how this works. Okay, let's take a look at the top of the lens. I have it written down as a shutter priority camera because the camera has two shutter speeds, 1/40th or 1/200th. In auto mode, the camera will pick the best shutter speed and aperture for your scene based on which shutter speed it's going to use. So the shutter speed it selects determines the aperture. In manual mode, you will select the aperture here from f2.8 to f22, and then the camera will pick the best shutter speed based on the aperture that you select. So that's how that works. When you look through the viewfinder, if there is not enough light for an exposure, a red flag will display in there, and that way the shutter button will not connect to take a photo. That will prevent you from accidentally taking a photo that will not turn out. The flash sync speed on this camera is 1/40th of a second, and in order to use that, the camera must be set to flash mode, and we'll see that as we go through it. The lens's quality for this, Olympus gave this a very, very good lens. According to the manual, the lens with a high quality film can deliver negatives which are enlargeable to 16 by 20 inches for print size, which is quite large for a half-frame negative. This is the exact same camera as the Olympus Pen EES with the addition of a hot shoe on top for flash use. That's the only difference between this and the EES. The target market for this camera was the small camera and point-and-shoot enthusiast, also for people who wanted to save money on film. It was designed specifically to be used for zone focusing and also to help people cut their film purchasing costs in half by giving you twice as many frames per 35mm roll. It was made by Olympus in Japan from 1968 to 1971. Now, if you have your Olympus Pen EES, we're going to go over all of the features on it, starting here on the top. Technically on the sides, we have a couple of lugs to connect a camera strap to. It came with, I think this is original, came with this wrist strap here. Film rewind knob and lever so that when you're done with your film, you can rewind it. Flash hot shoe. Model, shutter button, frame count dial right here, which I believe automatically resets. Let's find out if I remember correctly that the counter resets automatically. Yes, it does. There we go. So the frame counter resets as soon as you open the back of the camera. On top of the lens, we have your auto and manual aperture selection ring right here. so that you can either select your aperture yourself or you can use the camera in auto mode. Here we have your focus selection, which is close, as in a single person, two people, a distant like forest scene, and then infinity focus for distant landscapes. This is your ASA selection right here. Here we go. If you rotate the silver ring on your camera, you can select between different film speeds. The fastest is 400 ASA. ASA and ISO are the same thing, by the way. And then the slowest is 25 ISO. So your ISO range on this is 25 up to 400 in all of the standard third stop settings. The front of the camera has a few things to note. Olympus Pen, the make and series. Here we have the viewfinder window, the lens, the light meter, information about the lens here, 38mm f2.8 Olympus D-Zuico. That tells you how many elements are in the lens, by the way. I forget what the D is. It might just be 4. I can't remember for sure. Anyway, flash PC socket right here. The camera back only has a couple of things to look at. Here we have the viewfinder window and the film advance knob. So after you take a photo, you just advance the film, just like that with the knob. The camera's bottom only has a couple of things. Film rewind release right here, tripod socket, and then kind of on the side, we're going to call it on the bottom here, is the film back release. To get into the camera, you simply pull down on the film back release right here, and the film back will open. Inside the camera, we have the film cassette chamber. In just a moment when we load film, this is where it will go. These silver rails are your film guide rails. The outer two keep the film properly aligned as it moves through the camera, and the inner two sandwich up against the film pressure plate to keep the film flat so that light is focused properly on the film plane. This is the area of your negative right here. Film tension sprocket. When you advance the film, this spins to help keep the film moving smoothly through the camera. Film take-up spool. This takes up the film as you advance it so that the film can be pulled out of the cassette and taken up here. And then on the back, we have the film pressure plate right here that is used to keep the film flat up against the shutter area, the image area. To load film, we're going to pop the film rewind knob up and drop our 35mm cassette into the camera. We're going to pull out a leader as we push the film rewind knob back in. And once we have a leader, we feed it into the take-up spool here. Hold our fingers gently on top of the film tension sprocket and advance. We're going to repeat that for good measure. Now we can close the back of the camera, and we're going to advance 3 frames. If you notice that the film rewind knob is spinning as we do that, that's what we want. Okay, so we're going to advance until we're at frame 1. Now we're going to adjust the ISO dial until we have the ISO set on the number that we want to use for that film, and now we have loaded film. Okay, film, if you've never used it before, is one and done. It can record an image a single time with light that's been properly focused and controlled with a proper aperture and shutter speed when it reaches the film. Or film can record all of the photons that reach it in an uncontrolled manner like this. If you were to open up your film back with your film outside of the camera like this, all of the film that is outside of the cassette would be erased. You can't see the images on your film until you take it to a lab to be developed. But I want you to see what happens when you use film in this camera. Every time you take a photo, the film advances outside of the cassette. That's why this film cassette rewind spins as you take photos. And whenever you take an image, the photo here, the image part of the film here is going to be exposed to light to take the photo, and then it advances past that area to have so the next blank part of your film can receive light. Okay, so you're going through your day, you've shot your entire roll of film. Now it's time to rewind your film by pressing the film rewind button, flipping out the film rewind knob, and I'm going to use my finger here to hold that because the door is open, and then you just rewind your film. Okay. you should be able to hear that sound outside of the camera when you finish your roll of film. And when you have that, that means you're almost done. You're almost done rewinding the film. When you finish rewinding the film, at that point, you can then go ahead and open up the film back, and you will have your film rewound into the cassette here. Lift up your film rewind knob, and then you can just dump this into your hand like that. So it's always a good idea if you're going to send your film off to a lab just to rewind it the whole way so you don't accidentally reuse your film. Then if you're going to keep shooting, just take your next roll of film, load it in there and keep going. If you're not, close your film or push your film rewind post back in, close the film door, trigger the shutter, and set your camera off because you're done shooting for the day. All right, next up, let's talk about how to use the flash on this camera, and then I'll give you some basic tips and techniques for flash use to make you to give you the best results with it. With flash, you can plug a flash into the hot shoe, and any modern flash that you can get will work with this camera, but it only has a single contact, so all that's going to do is trigger the flash. Your best bet is to get a flash that has manual controls and a simple interface that you can run off of this. So you can also plug a flash in here. If your flash has a cable on it, the cable just plugs right into that socket, and now you can have a flash off camera. You could also do a flash off camera and on camera at the same time with this one, which is, I don't know, kind of neat to me. Anyway, with the flash, there's a limited range of settings you can use to have the flash work. Basically, on the aperture ring, you can see this says for flash right here. When you select a manual aperture with this camera from 2.8 to 22, the flash will trigger. The flash will not trigger in auto mode, or it shouldn't anyway. With a manually selected aperture, which is also stepless, you might notice that there are no click detents for each stop. You could set the aperture between 2.8 and 4, or here between 4 and 5.6 at approximately f5. You can select any aperture in this range, and the flash will fire at 1/40th of a second. The only speed that this camera will sync the flash at is 1/40th of a second, and selecting a manual aperture will force the camera to shoot at 1/40th of a second. Okay, that's pretty easy to do. So now having talked about the mechanics of how to connect and use a flash on this camera, let's talk about some basic tips. There is one place on a camera that is the worst possible place to connect a flash. Right here on top of the camera, directly above the lens. So why is that? If you have your flash right up here above the lens and it triggers, the light will leave the flash, reach your subject, and bounce back to your lens in like a flat wall. If you're using color film, your subjects will have red eye if they're people. If whatever you're taking a photo of, they'll look very flat and waxy when that happens. So there are a couple of things you can do to mitigate that. And the most important one is to have your flash mimic the way that we see light most of the time. So let's think for a minute about how we see light. If you're outside, we're under the sun or under street lights at night. If you're indoors, we have overhead lighting. So when you use a flash, if you can get one that has a head that will articulate like this, so you can bounce the light up to the ceiling and then have it bounce back to your subject and then to your camera lens, you're likely to have a better result that will produce a more flattering image for your subject. So this camera will let you do that. You can put a flash here if you have one that has an articulating head that points upward. Some lenses, in addition to articulation, they can also swivel, which gives you more control. For instance, if you have a wall but no ceiling. The other thing you can do with this camera that's really neat is you can get what's called a flash bar. And this is a flash bar here. It just screws into the tripod socket. And then the other end you can screw a flash into. And then that allows you to connect the PC port cable here to your flash and have your flash off of the camera. You can mount the flash on the flash bar and then use the flash bar as your ability to swivel the flash. Or you can not use a flash bar and hand hold your flash. Since you pretty much know what your focus point is going to be, you can preset that focus point, preset your aperture, handhold your flash, and then have a lot more control over how you use your flash with your camera. So those are some basic techniques you can use for flash. A key note on this camera with flash, you need a flash that has manual power settings. Most of them now do. And when you do that, you will need to know that flash's guide number, your film speed, and your subject distance, so you can manually calculate how much power to use from your flash so that you don't blow out your subject with too much light or have something that's super dark because there's not enough. Okay, all of that understood. Let's talk now about how to use the lens for composing an image. In general, you'll probably be spending most of your time in auto mode with this, but you can also manually select the aperture, as we've talked about. To focus, you'll want to choose between one of these 4 settings, which are slightly closer than close, but portrait of a single person, portrait of multiple people, group photo, a distant scene, and a very distant infinity focus scene. If you select this red app setting right here, this is your primary zone focus. This is your hyperfocal distance. With a small aperture, such as f/16, you can get everything from infinity to fairly close, probably about 5 feet, maybe a little bit less than that even, in suitable focus with a setting like this. So if you were just shooting all day and you had 200 ISO film in here in full sun, you could very easily just shoot everything like this and expect to have most everything that you would want in your photos be in focus from near to distant. And that would be a fine way to use this camera, relatively in line with how it was designed and intended to be used. Except that in this mode, you'd be stuck at 1/40th of a second. You'd have to use auto in this to get 1/200th of a second and f/16. But setting this to your red indicator here will give you zone focusing capabilities with this camera in full sun. So the next thing we have to do, since we've gone over basically everything, is talk about how to actually take a photo. And you've probably figured it out by now. You dial in your settings on the lens and you push the shutter button. Just use the viewfinder back here to kind of sight up your scene and decide what you want to have it look like. And then it's an automatic camera. It's pretty much going to do everything for you whenever you push the shutter button. So pretty straightforward, pretty user-friendly interface. So if you're going to do a double exposure with this camera, let's try and see if it'll work. First thing to do is take the slack out of the film, which I have actual film in here, so I can't go any further. Just crank this until you get resistance and no further. Okay. First thing you're going to do is take your first photo. Then you want to make sure that this is flipped out, and you're going to hold it, and you're going to push the film rewind button on the bottom in it and hold it while you advance the film. And that, if that worked, we'll rearm the shutter, and that is how you take a double exposure. Normally I would say here's the science of exposure, but with this you don't have control over that, so you pretty much just are going to put too much light on the film and deal with the contrast loss later when you get it back from being developed and go to digitize it or print it. But yes, you can in fact do a double exposure with this camera by using that technique. Now, after you finish your double exposure, you want to set this manually to f/22, put your lens cap on or put your hand over the lens and trip the shutter, and then advance it. The reason is because after you do that trick with the double exposure, the gearing isn't going to immediately start engaging again. And if you don't take a dead frame, then you will likely have overlapping frames on your double exposure, which will ruin the effort that you went to for your double exposure. So yes, you can in fact do double exposures with this camera. So next up, let's talk about some tips for making the most of this camera. First up, the manual suggests waiting until you're ready to take the next photo to advance the film, which preserves the mechanical shutter components, namely the springs. So, I mean, if you're like me, you're used to taking a photo and then immediately advancing, you'll want to break that habit. Take the photo and then don't advance until you're ready to take the next photo. And the reason for that is all of the mechanisms in here are mechanical. If you advance the film as soon as you're done, then you'll be putting that under tension. And as these are older now, if you do that and are walking around all day, you'll be walking around with the springs under tension all day, which could have some deleterious effects for the springs, whether or not they have the same tension in them, or potentially even if they could break if that happens for long enough. The next tip is that the EV numbers alone won't mean much to you, these EV numbers I'm about to read, but from EV8 to 11, the camera will pick f2.8 to f8 and 1/40th of a second for your shutter speed. And then from EV11 and for EV11 itself, it may also use instead 1/200th of a second and f2.8. And then from EV12 to 16, it will use 1/200th and then f4 to f22. So exposure values are a way of calculating exposure, and those ranges are the ranges that will determine the shutter speed and aperture combination that this camera will pick for you in automatic mode. That is everything for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next camera manual series.